The rain had been falling all day, an unbroken sheet of gray draping over the city. I watched the droplets race down my apartment window, merging together and disappearing, much like my thoughts these days. Writing had once been a way to escape from the chaos of life, but now it felt like I was trying to dig my way out of quicksand. Every word pulled me deeper into exhaustion and self-doubt. I was a freelance writer, though I hadn't been writing much lately. My income, always precarious, had become even more unstable. Each assignment seemed like a Herculean task, the simplest projects dragging on for days, sometimes weeks, as I wrestled with my dwindling creativity. There was a time when words flowed effortlessly, when stories spilled onto the page with a natural rhythm. But those days felt like they belonged to someone else. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd written something that truly excited me. The isolation wasn't helping. My small apartment, cluttered with stacks of books, old notes, and unfinished manuscripts, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. It was always too quiet. Occasionally, the muffled sounds of traffic or distant conversations would seep in through the thin walls, but they did little to break the heavy silence. Most days, I wouldn't speak a word out loud until the late afternoon, when I'd finally force myself to venture out for groceries or a cup of coffee, just to see some other human faces. Even then, my interactions were fleeting and empty. Quick exchanges with baristas or cashiers who probably wouldn't recognize me if I came in the next day. My friends, the ones I had shared laughs and secrets with in college, had all moved on to busy lives filled with families, careers, and social circles that I no longer fit into. The group chats that once buzzed with messages were now quiet, just like everything else. I would scroll through them sometimes, reading old conversations and wondering how the thread had become so frayed. I had tried reaching out, making small attempts to reconnect, but our conversations always felt forced, as if we were actors playing parts in a show that had long since been cancelled. Eventually, I stopped trying. The solitude grew thicker, and I began to fear it was becoming a part of me, wrapping itself around my bones like a second skin. It was on one of those bleak, rainy days that I decided I couldn't stay cooped up inside any longer. I grabbed my coat and left my apartment, not knowing where I was headed, just that I needed to escape, if only for a little while. The rain was cold as it hit my face, a sharp contrast to the stifling warmth of the apartment. I wandered aimlessly through the city, past familiar cafes and storefronts, not feeling any particular draw to any of them. My feet carried me down streets I rarely ventured, through neighborhoods that grew older and more weathered the deeper I went. Eventually, I found myself standing in a narrow, dimly lit alleyway I didn't recognize. It was tucked between two towering brick buildings, their facades stained dark with age and rain. I hesitated, wondering if I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, but then I saw it. An old wooden sign swaying slightly in the damp breeze. Lost Pages, it read, the letters barely visible under the layers of dust and grime. The bookstore's narrow windows were cluttered with faded paperbacks and old-fashioned leather-bound volumes, their covers dulled by time. The glass panes were fogged with moisture, and the light within was dim and flickering, as though the bulbs inside were just barely clinging to life. Curiosity piqued, I pushed open the door, and the old-fashioned bell above the frame jangled faintly. The air inside was heavy, filled with the scent of aged paper and wood polish. It was darker than I expected, with most of the light filtering in from the narrow front windows. The store was cluttered, chaotic even, with stacks of books piled high on tables and chairs, shelves sagging under the weight of countless volumes. Narrow aisles twisted and turned, leading deeper into the shadows. I wandered through the narrow aisles, running my fingers over the spines of books that seemed to belong to another era. Some were printed in faded typefaces, their covers cracked and peeling, while others looked like handmade journals, stitched together by someone's careful hands long ago. The deeper I ventured, the quieter the world seemed to grow. the hum of the city fading into the background, as if I had stepped into another time altogether. It was then that I saw it. The book lay on a small table tucked away in the back, almost hidden under a pile of yellowing maps and old stationery. It was a small, nondescript, leather-bound book, no larger than a pocket diary, and the cover was worn, its once rich brown faded to a dull, murky shade. There were no words on the spine, no title or author's name to give any hint as to what it contained. I picked it up, feeling an odd chill travel through my fingers as they brushed against the leather. It felt cold to the touch, much colder than any book should be. I opened it, expecting to see faded text or blank pages, but the pages weren't entirely blank. There were faint marks, almost like shadows of words, that seemed to shimmer and shift as I tilted the book under the dim light. It was as though the text was hiding, revealing itself only from certain angles. The sound of a floorboard creaking made me jump. I hadn't noticed the elderly man standing behind the counter, watching me with a faint, unreadable expression. He seemed to blend into the shadows, his clothes faded and old, just like everything else in the shop. "Find something interesting?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly, like it hadn't been used much lately. I held up the book. "What's this?" I asked, more to break the silence than out of any real expectation for an answer. The old man's eyes glinted in the low light. "The book finds those who need it," he said, as if reciting a well-practiced line. There was a hint of a smile on his lips, though it never quite reached his eyes. "Or perhaps, those it needs." I didn't know what to say to that, but something about the book held my attention. I felt an urge to take it with me, as though it were calling out, whispering just at the edge of my hearing. I glanced back at the man. "How much?" I asked. His smile widened ever so slightly. "For you, $5. It seemed too cheap for such an old book, but I reached into my wallet, handed him the money, and tucked the book under my arm. As I turned to leave, the old man called after me. "Be careful what you find," he said, his voice low and almost drowned out by the sound of the door creaking open. I glanced back, but he had already turned away, vanishing into the store's shadowed depths. Back in the quiet of my apartment, the book sat on my coffee table like a dark presence, a strange weight in the room. I couldn't seem to ignore it. It was as though it was waiting for me to open it, to uncover whatever secrets lay hidden within its pages. I finally sat down, picked it up, and cracked it open once more. Words filled the first page in a delicate, slanted script that looked handwritten, as if someone had carefully penned each letter. The words described a memory I had buried long ago, one that sent a shiver down my spine. It was from when I was a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old. My parents had taken me to a fair one summer night, filled with bright lights and music. I had wandered off, distracted by a booth selling trinkets, and before I knew it, my parents were nowhere to be found. I remember the panic that had seized me, the suffocating feeling of being lost in a sea of strangers. Hours seemed to pass before a security guard found me crying and reunited me with my frantic parents. How could this be? I had never told anyone about that experience, not in such vivid detail. Yet, here it was, written out in the book as if someone had been there with me, seeing and feeling everything I had in that moment of fear. The next morning, the unsettling memory from the book lingered in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had read a similar story somewhere before, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. It wasn't impossible. I had been under a lot of stress lately. I had to shake off the feeling and get out of the apartment. The walls seemed to be closing in on me, suffocating me. A walk would do me good. I put on my coat and left the apartment, letting the crisp autumn air fill my lungs. I walked aimlessly, allowing the city to swallow me up. The sound of traffic, the chatter of people, the hum of the city, it was all strangely soothing. My feet carried me through familiar streets, past the cafes and shops I frequented. until I ended up in a quieter part of town. I had walked here many times before. I knew these streets well, or so I thought. I had barely taken a few steps down a narrow side street when I felt a strange sensation wash over me, a tingling chill that prickled the back of my neck. The street looked the same, yet different. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite place. I glanced around, suddenly aware that the street signs didn't match the names I remembered. Panic began to creep in, and I reached for my phone to check the GPS. But when I pulled up the map, my location was a blank, gray void. I closed the app and reopened it, thinking it was just a glitch, but the result was the same. No roads, no landmarks, no street names, just an empty screen. A wave of dizziness swept over me, and I felt as if the world had shifted somehow, as though I had walked into a different version of the city. I continued walking. I passed buildings I didn't recognize, shops that hadn't been there the last time I visited this part of town. The more I walked, the more disoriented I became, and soon I couldn't tell which way I had come from. It wasn't long before a thick fog began to roll in, wrapping itself around the streets like a damp blanket. It came in fast, swallowing up the pavement and rising up to knee level. The fog was dense, more like smoke than mist, and it clung to me, its cold fingers wrapping around my legs, urging me to stop. I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. My heart pounded in my chest as the world seemed to fade away, consumed by the murk. My legs trembled and I stumbled forward, driven by a need to escape the suffocating fog. I turned down another street, then another. I began to run, my breaths coming in ragged gasps, until I finally saw a break in the fog, a familiar intersection up ahead. I staggered out of the haze, collapsing onto a bench at the side of the road. The fog was still there, hanging over the street like a curtain, but it didn't seem to reach me anymore. I could see the familiar shops and cafes now, the traffic flowing smoothly, as if nothing unusual had happened. I sat there for a long time, catching my breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. Had I imagined it? It all seemed impossible, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But when I checked the time, nearly 2 hours had passed. 2 hours of wandering in a place that shouldn't have existed. I couldn't explain it, and a part of me didn't want to. I just wanted to go home and forget about it. After the disorienting events of the day, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat at my desk, the dim glow of the lamp casting a soft halo of light over the pages of the book. I had to know what it would reveal next, no matter how unnerving. My hands shook as I opened the leather cover, bracing myself for whatever story might appear. Slowly, the faint traces of words began to surface on the page, growing clearer with each passing moment. The text described a claustrophobic feeling, a fear of being trapped in a small space, and of the walls closing in. It talked about the sensation of suffocating, the inability to breathe, and the irrational certainty that the space itself was shrinking. The fear was so vividly described that I could almost feel the walls pressing in around me. I closed the book abruptly, my pulse quickening. I stood up and began pacing the room, trying to shake off the creeping sensation of unease. But then I noticed something strange. As I passed by the wall near my bed, I thought I saw it move. Just a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, like a breath. I turned quickly, staring at the spot, but it was still, silent. It had to be my imagination. I was letting the book get to me, feeding into my own anxieties. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was all in my head, but when I stepped closer, I felt it, a soft vibration, almost like a heartbeat. I reached out and placed my hand against the wall. It was warm, too warm, and there was a subtle give to the surface, like it wasn't quite solid. I jerked my hand back, my breath coming in short gasps. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the wall. It pulsed again, and this time, I was sure of it. It was moving, expanding outward ever so slightly, then contracting again. The room seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker, as though the walls were pressing in from all sides. Desperation clawed at my mind. I couldn't stay here, not like this. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen and approached the wall, gripping the handle with trembling fingers. If there was something wrong with the wall, I needed to see it for myself. I pressed the blade against the surface and dragged it downward, tearing through the wallpaper. Beneath the surface, a dark substance oozed out, a thick, viscous fluid that glistened under the dim light. The wall itself seemed to throb, like an open wound, and I could see a network of veins coursing just below the surface, pulsating with a dark fluid that seemed to breathe along with the room. I stumbled back, horrified by the sight, as the walls seemed to bulge inward, suffocating me with their closeness. The room grew warmer, the air stagnant and heavy. I could barely think, barely breathe. I backed toward the door, desperate to escape. I flung the door open and fled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The corridor outside was cool, blessedly still, and I collapsed against the opposite wall, my breath ragged and uneven. I didn't know how long I sat there, trembling, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. When I finally summoned the courage to look back into the apartment, the walls appeared normal, solid, undisturbed. The tear in the wallpaper was gone. I eventually went to sleep, although I barely slept that night. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across my cluttered desk. The events of the previous night clung to me like a fog, heavy, suffocating, impossible to shake. The book sat closed on the desk, its leather cover cracked and worn. I had almost convinced myself not to open it again, but my mind kept returning to the feeling of the wall under my fingers, pulsing with a life of its own. I needed answers, and I was sure they wouldn't come from the pages of that cursed book. Instead, I made my way out of the apartment and headed back to where all this had started, the old bookstore, Lost Pages. I walked through the crowded streets, the noise of the city buzzing in the background, but it all felt distant. As I approached the narrow alleyway, a sense of dread gnawed at me. I had to find the bookstore. I had to know that it was real, that I wasn't imagining things. But when I reached the spot where I had first stumbled upon Lost Pages, there was nothing there. The alleyway was narrow and cluttered with old crates and garbage bins, but no bookstore. There wasn't even a sign that a shop had ever existed there. I searched the walls, running my fingers over the worn bricks, as if I could somehow find a hidden doorway. I called out into the empty space, my voice echoing back at me. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. Lost Pages was gone. Or perhaps it had never existed in the first place. I stumbled back out onto the main street, my heart pounding. If the bookstore wasn't real, then what did that mean for the book? I needed someone else to see it. Someone who could tell me if I was going crazy or if there was something genuinely unnatural about the book. There was only one person I could think of who might take me seriously. My old friend, Emily. She was the kind of person who always had an open mind, who never dismissed things out of hand. We hadn't been close in recent years, but I hoped that she would still be willing to help. When I reached her apartment, I hesitated before knocking. My hand hovered in the air for a moment before I finally rapped on the door. She answered with a look of surprise, her expression softening when she recognized me. "Daniel, it's been a while," she said, a mix of curiosity and concern in her voice. I forced a smile, though it felt brittle. "I know, and I'm sorry to show up out of the blue like this. I need your help with something." She invited me inside, and we sat down at her small kitchen table. The book was heavy in my hands as I set it down in front of her, opening to the first blank page. Emily looked at the book, then back at me, a puzzled expression crossing her face. "It's just an old book," she said, flipping through the pages. "There's nothing written here." My stomach sank. No, there was something. There were words on the pages, detailed descriptions, almost like it was reading my thoughts. Emily's brow furrowed as she closed the book and looked at me with a mix of sympathy and doubt. Daniel, I'm not saying you're lying, but are you sure you weren't imagining it? Maybe you're just under a lot of stress and I interrupted her, my voice rising. No, I saw it. The words were there and then things started happening, things that I read in the book. It's like it's manifesting my fears. Emily's expression softened, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. Okay, let's just take a breath. Maybe we can figure this out together. If you're feeling overwhelmed, I'm here for you. I wanted to believe her, but the pit of dread inside me only deepened. Emily had always been calm and rational, but now that calmness felt like dismissal, like she couldn't see what was right in front of her. I took the book back, clutching it to my chest as I left her apartment. The doubt crept into my mind, whispering that maybe she was right, maybe I was just losing my grip on reality. But as I walked back to my apartment, a sense of wrongness clung to me. It was as though the world itself had shifted just slightly. The people passing by seemed distant, their expressions vacant. And when I tried to engage with someone, a stranger at a cafe, a cashier at the grocery store, their responses were delayed, as if they were distracted by something I couldn't see. I reached my building, every step feeling heavier than the last. I glanced at the book tucked under my arm. Its pages felt cold, as though it were somehow absorbing the life from the world around me. The weight of Emily's skepticism hung over me like a dark cloud, intensifying my anxiety. As night fell, my apartment seemed even more stifling than usual. The silence pressed in from all sides, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. The book lay closed on my desk, but I felt its presence, almost as if it were calling to me. I resisted the urge to open it again, but my mind kept drifting back to the previous entries, replaying the details over and over. I tried to distract myself, scrolling aimlessly through my phone and flipping through TV channels, but nothing could hold my attention. A deep sense of unease had settled in, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was just around the corner. Then, the phone rang. The sudden sound startled me, my heart skipping a beat. I glanced at the clock, 11:34 p.m. Who would be calling at this hour? The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something compelled me to answer. I lifted the phone to my ear, and all I heard was static, a low, continuous hiss that sent a shiver down my spine. "Hello," I said tentatively, but there was no response, only static, and then, faintly, as if from far away, I thought I heard my name. It was barely a whisper, distorted and warping through the static, but it was there. "Hello?" I repeated, my voice growing uneasy. There was a faint click, and then the static stopped. For a moment, the line was dead silent, and I was about to hang up when a voice emerged from the quiet, soft and familiar. It was my grandmother's voice. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She had passed away over a decade ago. "Daniel," she said, her voice clear yet hollow, "remember the story I used to tell you?" My breath caught in my throat. I had no words, only a growing sense of dread. She had always told me bedtime stories as a child, comforting me when I was scared of the dark. "I'm here, Daniel," the voice continued, but it was beginning to distort, warping into something that no longer sounded quite human. It was as if multiple voices were overlapping, speaking in unison, and none of them belonged to her anymore. The phone slipped from my trembling hand and clattered onto the floor. I stumbled back, my skin prickling with cold sweat. I forced myself to pick up the phone and check the call log. The number was still there, but when I tried to call it back, the line was disconnected. With shaking hands, I reached for the book. I knew I shouldn't open it again, that I should throw it away or burn it, but the need for answers, no, for some kind of explanation, was overwhelming. I opened the book to a random page, and there it was, an entry written in neat, faded script. A fear of the past reaching out to the present, the voice of a loved one long gone, breaking the silence of the night. I closed the book and slid it to the far edge of the desk, but the unease lingered, crawling over my skin like static. The next morning, I called Emily. She'd been one of the few friends who had stuck by me through the rough patches, and I hoped her voice would bring me some clarity. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. I tried again, and still, only the monotonous drone of the ringing met my ears. A heavy knot formed in my chest, tightening with every unanswered call. I texted her, then tried calling some other friends, just to hear someone's voice. Nothing, not a single response. It was as though my messages were being cast into a void, swallowed up without leaving a trace. Panic began to creep in. I needed to see Emily in person, to confirm that everything was normal. I drove over to her apartment. When I arrived, her building looked just as I remembered, the faded brick walls and narrow windows standing silently against the gray sky. But when I reached her door and knocked, there was no response. I knocked harder, then pounded. Still, nothing. I tried the doorbell. No answer. It was as if the entire building had gone silent. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sound, any sign of life. There was only the faint hum of the distant traffic, the muted ticking of a nearby clock. I went to the building's manager to see if Emily was home. His face was blank when I asked him about her. He scratched his head and said, "Are you sure you have the right building?" He stared at me like I was some stranger speaking a different language. "She lives here," I insisted, feeling a mixture of fear and anger rising within me. "I've been to her apartment before." He shook his head slowly. "Sorry, but I've worked here for years, and I don't recall anyone named Emily living here." His tone was indifferent, almost dismissive. It was impossible. I had visited Emily countless times. I knew her apartment. It had to be a mistake, or a sick joke. As I left the building, a chill ran down my spine. The streets outside seemed oddly empty, with fewer cars and people than I remembered. I wandered aimlessly, trying to shake off the sense of abandonment that gnawed at my gut. I went to other places Emily and I used to frequent, our favorite cafe, the park where we used to meet, even the bookstore where she worked for a time. Each place seemed devoid of any sign that she had ever existed. When I asked people at the cafe if they knew her, the barista looked at me as if I were crazy. The world around me felt thinner, like it was losing its substance, becoming a shadow of itself. I reached for my phone again, frantically scrolling through my contacts. It wasn't just Emily. Other people were missing too. Friends, acquaintances, even family members, all gone, as though they had never been a part of my life. I drove to my parents' house, the roads growing eerily quiet as I neared the familiar neighborhood. When I arrived, the house stood empty, the windows dark and lifeless. I pounded on the door, shouting their names, but there was no answer. The door swung open, revealing a barren, dust-covered interior that looked as though it hadn't been lived in for years. I stumbled back, my thoughts a chaotic swirl. I tried dialing my parents' number, but the call didn't go through. There was only a hollow voice saying, "The number you have dialed is not in service." It repeated the message again and again, as if mocking me. My world was shrinking. The people I had known, the places that had been so familiar, were slipping away. It felt as if reality itself was erasing them, leaving me isolated in an increasingly empty world. I tried visiting an old friend who lived in the next town over. When he answered the door, his face was pale and vacant, his eyes unfocused as though he was half asleep. Do you remember me?" I asked, my voice trembling with desperation. "We used to hang out all the time. Don't you remember?" He blinked at me, his gaze unfocused. "You shouldn't have opened the book," he murmured, his voice flat, as if reciting something from memory. "What?" I stepped back, my skin crawling. "What did you say?" His expression remained unchanged, his lips moving soundlessly before he repeated the phrase, "You should have never opened the book." His eyes seemed to glaze over as he spoke, and I felt a coldness settle over me, a dreadful certainty that I was slipping further away from the world I once knew. I left in a daze, my mind racing with questions, but no answers came. As I drove back to my apartment, the streets were emptier than ever. It felt like a dream, a nightmare that I was unable to wake up from. And all I could do was keep driving, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, would still be there when I returned. By the time I reached my apartment, night had already fallen, and an oppressive silence seemed to blanket the building. I hesitated before unlocking the door, a nagging sensation that I was walking into a trap, but I had nowhere else to go. It felt like the entire world had been swallowed by darkness, and this was the last patch of ground that still existed. As I stepped inside, the air felt colder than usual, and a strange quiet settled over the place. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. I tried another one, but the bulbs stayed dark. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Standing across the street, directly facing my window, was a pale figure. I could feel its gaze, heavy and unyielding, boring into me from across the street. The figure wasn't moving. It wore a pale, featureless face, blank and devoid of expression. Its surface reflecting the streetlights in a way that made it seem almost translucent. And then it disappeared. Over the next few days, the figure would return. Sometimes it appeared outside the living room window, other times at the back, near the alley. As time went on, the figure crept closer and closer until one night, I found it standing directly outside my bedroom window, its pale face peering in through the glass. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat as I locked eyes with it, or what would have been its eyes if it had any. There was nothing there, only a smooth, featureless surface that somehow managed to exude a sense of malevolence. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The days blurred together after the encounter with the pale figure. Sleep became a rare occurrence, and when I did manage to close my eyes, I found myself trapped in a maze of dark corridors and whispering shadows. Each time I woke, I half expected to see the figure standing over my bed, watching, waiting. One night, I found the book resting on the kitchen counter, its pages fluttering open as if caught by an invisible breeze. The words faded into view, and I read them with a sense of grim inevitability. The fear that everything around you is just a reflection of your mind, that reality is bending to your will, or your despair. I shivered as the room seemed to grow colder, the lights dimming as though a shadow had passed over them. I grabbed the book and threw it across the room in frustration, the leather cover thudding against the wall. It landed with a heavy slap, lying there with its pages fanned out. For a brief moment, I thought that might be the end of it, that I could force the fear away by sheer willpower. But then the lights flickered, and the familiar chill settled over the apartment. There was a pressure in the air, a sensation like being watched. I turned, and the walls seemed to bend inward, as if being drawn toward a single point in the living room. I watched, frozen in place, as a shape began to form, a dark, indistinct mass that seemed to pulse and shift like a living shadow. It was as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling before my eyes. Then, the shadow parted, and the figure emerged, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate grace. Its form was more defined now, almost human, yet there was an unnatural fluidity to its movements. It seemed to float just above the ground, its limbs swaying as if caught in a current. The figure's face remained featureless, but its presence was unmistakably more powerful, as if it had grown stronger with every fear I had confronted. And as it moved closer, I realized something. It wasn't just feeding on my fear, it was shaping itself based on the darkest parts of my mind. It was then that the truth began to settle in, a cold, unyielding realization that clawed its way into my thoughts. The figure wasn't an external force, it was a manifestation of the book, of my own mind. The book wasn't just documenting my fears, it was bringing them to life. I tried to steady myself, to gather my thoughts, but the room seemed to pulse in time with the figure's approach. The air grew heavier, and a low hum filled the space, vibrating through the walls. The figure stopped a few feet away from me, its pale, featureless head tilting to the side as if studying me. Then it spoke. Not in a voice, but through a thought that seemed to echo in my mind. It was a presence that filled the room, a darkness that whispered my name. "You brought me here." The figure stepped even closer. I steadied my breathing, forcing myself to confront the figure before me. The pale entity stood motionless, and its form flickering as if caught between two worlds. Its presence radiated a bone-deep cold, a chill that seemed to seep into the air itself. "I know what you are," I said, my voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "You are my fears, my doubts, my anxieties, everything I've tried to push away, but you are not stronger than me." The pale figure's expression remained unchanged, but I sensed a shift in the darkness surrounding us. It seemed to pulse, reacting to my words, as though the very fabric of the nightmare was beginning to fray at the edges. "I accept that these fears are a part of me," I continued, "but they don't define who I am. I am more than my darkest thoughts, more than the terror that tries to consume me." For a moment, the figure stood as if frozen, its form wavering, becoming less solid. The air grew lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. The figure's shape blurred, its outline dissolving into a haze of gray smoke. As the last remnants of its form began to dissipate, the whispering ceased, replaced by an almost deafening silence. I watched as the entity melted away into nothingness, leaving only faint traces of mist that quickly faded. As I looked around, my surroundings began to change. The walls of my apartment shifted back to their normal dimensions, the suffocating darkness lifting. The oppressive silence gave way to the familiar hum of city life outside my window, a welcome reminder that I had returned to reality. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the distance and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I cautiously reached for my phone, half expecting it to show nothing but static or disconnected lines. But to my surprise, my contacts were all there. I sent a message to Emily, and almost immediately, she replied, asking where I had been. Relief flooded through me, a feeling so intense that it was almost overwhelming. I was back. I was real. My friends, my life, everything was as it should be. The apartment no longer felt like a nightmarish labyrinth. It was just my home, plain and familiar, with the clutter of books and papers on the coffee table, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. I sank onto the couch while holding the book. It was lighter than I remembered, as if some unseen burden had been lifted from its pages. As I sat there, a thought crept into my mind. This experience wasn't something I could forget, nor should I. The book was more than a cursed object. It was a mirror that had forced me to confront what I had buried deep within myself. In some strange, unsettling way, it had helped me. It had shown me that facing the darkness was the only way to let the light back in. I decided to keep the book, not as a relic of horror, but as a reminder of the darkness I had faced and the strength it took to overcome it. I placed it on my shelf, where it sat among other leather-bound volumes. From a distance, it looked ordinary, unremarkable, as though it was just another book in my collection. But I knew that if I ever needed to remember the lessons I had learned, the book would be there, waiting to remind me of what I had endured and conquered. As the days passed, life seemed to return to normal. My anxiety didn't vanish overnight, but it no longer had the same power over me. I had confronted the fears that had once ruled my life, and I had come out on the other side stronger. The book remained a part of me, a silent witness to the darkness I had faced, and a testament to the fact that even the deepest fears could be challenged.